So this webinar is our first experiment in doing a peer-to-peer learning exchange. And we're going to hear from the conservation enterprise work, which are both wildlife-based enterprises in Zambia and Uganda. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is what our agenda looks like today. We're just going to do a quick introduction and look at our learning group theories of change and talk a little bit about what peer-to-peer assist and share means. Then we're going to focus first on the Uganda portfolio, and then second on the Zambia portfolio, and then have time at the end for questions and discussion. And so that's our plan today. We are using the chat box, and we will record this webinar as well and post it on our learning group website for everyone to come back to in the future. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this is just a quick review of the learning questions for the conservation enterprise theory of change. I'm not going to read this off to you, but it's just to emphasize again that all of our presentations will talk a little bit about kind of what our theory of change is for conservation enterprises, that when we actually have the conditions in place to have a functioning business and a functioning enterprise, that we assume that that will provide benefits to stakeholders, and that if those stakeholders receive those benefits, then there will be an attitude and behavior change that will ultimately reduce threats to biodiversity and lead to biodiversity conservation. If we could have the next slide, please. So this is going to be our first poll question. We tried to weave in a couple different polls throughout the webinar for you. And this is, again, just a yes or no question, and we'll use poll everywhere. And I'm counting on Nathan to show me how we're going to do that. Do you want to explain what you would like people to do for this poll question?
Sure. Yeah. So if you can just follow the link that I just put in the chat box, everyone, you'll be asked to quickly type in your name or your initials, and then you can answer this question. It is active right now.
So as people are doing the poll everywhere question, oh, it's in real time. So somebody's figuring it out. We'll give it one more time up. Nope. So let's move on to the next slide. That looks like a great response so far. We'll have one more poll question in the middle after our first group of presenters, so we will come back to that. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce our speakers today. We have a great lineup, and I'm really appreciative of the time that everyone has taken to both work on presenting this webinar for us and just to be here with us, because we're all working in kind of a new situation. And I know Shauna is in a very unfriendly time zone for this. Angela and Jessiel have made a special trip into the embassy just to make sure they had a good internet connection. And I just wanted to be sure to share that appreciation from the very beginning. So our first speaker is going to be Shauna Hirsch. Shauna has been in Uganda since 2015, where she is the Environment, Natural Resources, and Climate Change Unit Leader. And she works on climate change, biodiversity, and conservation enterprises. And in particular, we've had a long history of working with Shauna on enterprises in Uganda, so I really look forward to hearing what she's going to share with us today. Prior to being in Uganda, Shauna was at USAID Liberia, where she worked on smallholder palm production, community forestry, and also enterprises there. Shauna's been a science educator, a Peace Corps volunteer, and also worked for both environmental NGOs and the US Environmental Protection Agency. We also are going to hear from Maggie McMurrow. Maggie is an engineer and works in the Regional Economic Growth Office at USAID West Africa. She's worked for 15 years supporting cities and utilities to reach their goals in water and wastewater, energy, and natural resource management. She has also been the lead managing the partnership between USAID and NASA on the Severe West Africa program that works to help access geospatial data for decision making. And also we'll hear from Angela Kabuswe. She is the environment specialist at USAID Zambia and works in the Environment and Economic Development Office for the last 5 years. Angela has worked on programs related to energy, climate change, biodiversity, and forestry, both in program design and implementation, working with different stakeholders, providing technical support and advice for effective design of new programs. Prior to working with USAID, Angela worked with the Ministry of Environment for over 11 years and was involved in working on environment and natural resources policy. And last but not least, we'll hear from Jasiel Msoka. Jasiel is a natural resource management specialist with USAID Zambia. Prior to joining USAID in 2017, he worked with Zambia's Department of National Parks and Wildlife on large mammal population monitoring and CITES. He's also worked with a local NGO on large carnivore research in Western Zambia and has worked in natural resource management in Zambia for the past 16 years. So we are going to benefit from this vast experience base that our speakers are bringing to us today. And the rationale behind a peer assist is to help, in this case, the transition of Maggie going to Uganda. We're going to have an exchange between Shauna explaining kind of what the history and the theory of change behind conservation enterprises in Uganda to prepare her for her transition to Uganda. And then our Zambian colleagues will do the same for Zambian conservation enterprises to prepare Shauna, who's going to Zambia. So that's the rationale for today's presentation. Maybe the next slide, please.
Great, thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Shauna, over to you.
Okay, great. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to start off with just a really brief history and look at our current portfolio. So in Uganda, we've had a really long history of support for both protected area management and small-scale conservation enterprises, but really historically the focus had been on ecotourism. But in 2014, the Ugandan government passed a law, the Anti-Homosexuality Act, and the US government response to that was to halt all support for tourism in Uganda. And so that really hit the portfolio, and we had to look at you know, how we adapted our approach to biodiversity conservation programming in the absence of being able to support ecotourism. And so that really halted our work in ecotourism for about a year while there was a redesign of the portfolio and the biodiversity program to then look at what potential other conservation enterprises could continue to support conservation without tourism. And then, so through that work in the biodiversity program, we were looking at things like chili production and honey production. And what we really learned from that is that we saw some small scale localized impact in terms of economic opportunities for communities, but that we really needed to look more at what the enabling environment was and how we were engaging with the private sector and broader market linkages in order to see a more transformative impact at the landscape level. And so then through our CDCS process, really kind of taking a look at that, the Uganda mission has a very integrated strategy. And so we were looking at then what does that look for natural resource management and for conservation. That's a small part of a portfolio that's really focused on health and feed the future. And so we started to orient our programs then across both the resilience and kind of a higher level systems development objectives. And so the current portfolio then is really built around these three themes of focusing on resilience of ecosystems and the communities they support. So a lot of the site-based programming and our new activity, the Biodiversity for Resilience activity, coming online is really the flagship activity for this. And it includes a strong focus on conservation enterprises, linking to broader markets, community conservancy work, as well as then the traditional work that we've been doing around protected area managing and ecological monitoring. And then the second piece is really a focus on species and the enterprises they support. So again, you know, the Anti-Homosexuality Act was overturned by the Ugandan Supreme Court. And so we've been able to ease back into support for tourism. And so but one of the things that we learned is that we really can't be focusing those enterprises or work in one specific area. So we're looking at tourism as one part of the broader portfolio. And then this also captures the work that we're doing in combating wildlife trafficking as well. And then the third element of the portfolio is really looking at system strengthening. So primarily working with the government of Uganda at the national level, with district and local governments, as well as community-based natural resource management groups, to really look at what are key elements around, whether it's enabling environment, access to finance, those different pieces that need to be in place to really see that kind of conservation impact. So next slide, please. So how did we get there in terms of the design? Because we're really at the point now in Uganda where we've put a lot of focus into designing the portfolio, and these new activities are actually coming online this month. And so we have the Biodiversity for Resilience activity, a Combating Wildlife Crime activity, and the Uganda Biodiversity Fund is support for really bridging the conservation financing gap in Uganda. So it's a trust fund that works on biodiversity offsets, but also grants to communities and other conservation organizations, and kind of working at that systems level in terms of financing conservation. And then we're also working with the National Forestry Authority to support, to strengthen forest management systems, both at the site level as well as the national level in Uganda. And so to get there, you know, we had a lot of learning, and we worked with measuring impact really from the kind of learning all the way through the design phase. And so we started off by looking at the Conservation Enterprise Learning Review, where we really tried to hone in on, you know, with this big shift in the portfolio, were we actually seeing a conservation impact from things like the honey enterprise and the chili enterprise? And we realized that it was really too soon to answer that question. And we also didn't have the baseline data in terms of biophysical conditions to really hit have that understanding of what the conservation impact was. And so we started to look then in this learning review at what some of the enabling conditions that needed to be in place to support these types of conservation-friendly enterprises were. And then to add to that analysis, we worked with the Democracy Center and did a targeted PEA around oil and biodiversity in Uganda that really helped us hone in on what the potential impacts of oil production were and the movements of populations in these areas would be on biodiversity. And that really highlighted some key areas that we weren't as aware of in terms of elite land capture that were really impacting conservation. And then from there, we worked with our Washington colleagues and measuring impact on using these analyses and the experience of our activities to develop a situation model and problem analysis. And then we went through an initial design week where we developed then preliminary results chains for looking holistically at the portfolio. And then from there, we engaged in a very robust stakeholder engagement process where we had consultations in both in Kampala, and then we went out in the field and met with government, with the private sector, with beneficiaries from previous programming and other groups that were both engaged in the conservation enterprises and the conservancy work, as well as other stakeholders that were engaged, for example, in agricultural production. And so we really pulled all of that together and refined the situation model and the results chains. And then we basically locked everyone in a room and assess where we brought in our financial management office, our contracting office, as well as, you know, folks from technical teams across the mission to pull together then the final design package. So that was our process that we went through, and we had some really great support from both Washington and Measuring Impact as we did this. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of then kind of bringing it back to the actual activities, what we learned and how we, along that theory of change. And so I'm going to go to the end and just reiterate that point around the direct link to biodiversity conservation is that we haven't really been able to measure that direct impact yet. And that's a core focus of the new activities. And on the other end of the results chain is really understanding that for these enterprises to be successful, we really need to focus on not just the technical aspects of conservation and understanding of those systems, but we need the business development skills support, work on access to finance, and land tenure issues are very significant. And then also the broader market linkages are important. So we saw a real localized positive economic impact for these conservation groups, but they were not successful in that sustained market linkage. And that's something that is a core focus of the activities going forward. And then the last point I wanted to make was this idea of what we learned in the consultations around this idea of the basket of benefits, and that communities and other stakeholders, and especially conservation NGOs as well, really identified that for them to engage positively in conservation, that they really needed access to other services like healthcare, like education, that these basket of benefits really needed to be in place as part of that bigger picture for support for conservation. So if we go to the next slide. So I don't know if Maggie, if you wanted to jump in on the questions.
Thanks, Shauna. I don't have a ton of questions, and I really appreciate your presentation because it gives me some really great background. You know, I'm really coming into this pretty new, so I'm interested in why there's a conservation focus in Uganda. Did you guys do a series of studies? Was this a government priority? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, conservation is a government priority, but at the same time, as I'm sure this is common in a lot of countries, extremely underfunded in Uganda. I think the current statistics are that tourism in Uganda, 80% of which is nature-based tourism, is bringing in about 1.5 billion US dollars a year into the Ugandan economy. A lot of that is focused on guerrilla tourism, and then visits to like Murchison Falls National Park, and the Jinja area. So I think what we recognize is that tourism, nature-based tourism, and this biodiversity is really important for the Ugandan economy, but they're not investing the resources in that. So even with, for example, a lot of studies through the Ministry of the Water and Environment have really identified that healthy ecosystems are foundational elements of Uganda's livelihoods and health. But those trends, again, don't support that. So you have huge population pressure adjacent to these protected areas that are really putting a lot of pressure, not just on the biodiversity, but also on those ecosystem services that are really critical for agricultural production, to meet the needs of these populations. And so I think the focus on conservation is really around the biodiversity earmark. I would also add that Uganda is one of the NDAC countries, and so it's really a transit point due to porous borders and poor enforcement. Really, it's a transit point for a lot of the illegal wildlife trade, and things coming from other countries in the region. And so all of those things kind of have fed into the current iteration of the portfolio, which, yeah, so I think, and it's challenging to kind of talk about the governments because they say it's important, it's highlighted in the National Development Plan, but again, it remains critically underfunded, the sector.
And I know we're running a bit out of time, but are there other kind of political economy aspects that either incentivize environmental protection or disincentivize it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And just in terms of what you would need to know coming into the mission, I mean, corruption is endemic, not just in the biodiversity natural resource management sector, but across sectors. And in addition to that, we have an election cycle coming up. And so what we've seen in the past is during those election years, you really see interesting policies and proposals coming from the national level, as well as local, district and local governments that disincentivize conservation. Things like de-gazetting central forest reserves, so that people ostensibly have the access to these resources for economic gain. Those types of things frequently happen during those election cycles. And so that's something that we're very aware of, because the elections are in 2021 in Uganda. I think another interesting aspect of our portfolio is the integrated element of it, is that we recognize, particularly around combating wildlife crime, that we didn't have sufficient biodiversity resources to tackle this issue on our own. And so we've put about $1 million of the biodiversity funds we have into a $50 million joint activity between DFID and our Democracy, Rights and Governance Office around broader public accountability, transparency, and anti-corruption. And DFID is matching our resources. So we're kind of capitalizing on the broader anti-corruption work while also having a wildlife specific stream or focus area within that activity. On the conservation enterprise and the market linkages, our Feed the Future portfolio is really taking a market systems based approach. And so the biodiversity for resilience activity is linked to the global food security strategy country plan for Uganda. We are getting FTF resources to support specifically those conservation enterprises that will hopefully be benefiting conservation, but then also support that kind of broader economic development in these landscapes.
Great, thanks so much.
Great, thanks Shauna, and thanks Maggie. please be thinking of any other questions that you might have. We are collecting questions in the chat box too, and we'll have some more time at the end for discussion. If we could have the next slide, I think we have a poll question. And that is really trying to harness the knowledge from the crowd of people. We have almost 40 participants on this webinar. And I'm sure a lot of you have either moved around yourselves or you've been, employed at USAID in the field and really seen the transition of foreign service officers in the field. So we really want to hear from you. Again, another poll everywhere question. When you have moved to new posts, what's been the most helpful tip or kind of action that has worked for you? And we will collect these during the next segment of the webinar and then come back to them at the end. We have the poll link there in the chat box. And thanks for sending in your questions. I know it's working for somebody. We have understanding the political economy, especially for different stakeholder groups. Yeah, and if it doesn't work, the poll everywhere isn't working for you or it's too onerous, just put your tip in the chat box and we'll collect them. So I think just to make sure we have enough time to hear from Zambia, let's move on to the next slide. And I will turn it over to Angela first. She's going to talk a little bit about the conservation enterprise work at USAID Zambia. So Angela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Megan, and hello everyone. So I think I'm just going to go straight right into my presentation. Thank you so much to Shona for the Uganda perspective. So for Zambia, I'm going to start by giving a brief background of our portfolio for biodiversity. So we started implementing biodiversity activities in 2014 when we had our biodiversity pad approved. And of course, this was informed by the environmental threats and opportunity assessment that was done in order for us to know which landscapes we wanted to focus on. So currently we do focus on 2 areas, Kafue and the Luangwa landscapes. So in terms of our main goal for biodiversity, it's basically to conserve biodiversity in significant priority areas, the ones that I've talked about, the Kafue and Luangwa. And of course, we want to secure the livelihoods of people who are living around these protected areas. And this is in line with our development objective, which seeks to reduce rural poverty through enterprise-driven inclusive economic growth. So in terms of the activities that have been supported under biodiversity, we receive 3 million every year of biodiversity funding, and we have 25% earmark for combating wildlife trafficking. So for the activities that we have implemented since 2014 when we started activities, we've had 3 main activities that we have supported, and all of them have had law enforcement building capacity kind of interventions, and only one of them had conservation enterprise interventions. And this is the North Luangwa Ecosystem Project. And I think for the rest of the presentation, this is where my colleague and I are going to focus our presentation, just to talk about our experience with some of the conservation enterprises that we supported through the North Luangwa Ecosystem Project. So I must mention again from the beginning that with the North Luangwa Ecosystem Project, the project ended last year in May. It was a 3-year activity. It was a fixed amount award. And in terms of the design process for this activity, at the time that we're doing the design, we didn't use the theory of change for conservation enterprise at the time, but of course we used other kinds of thought process. So we didn't really go through the questions that we now have under the theory of change. So I think that for us has been a lessons learned, looking through that and seeing what our experience has been. So in terms of what we supported under the North Luangwa, some of the activities that we tried to support included the community game ranching for the communities living around the North Luangwa National Park in the game management areas. We had beekeeping activities, horticulture, and the community conservation banks. So the community conservation banks are basically micro-lending and saving groups for the communities. And I think this is what we want to focus on for this presentation. So basically what happened was we had 22 COCOBAs, the micro-lending groups that were formed with support with the project. And under this, if you look at the representation, you find that 70%, almost 70% of the representation were women. So these groups were very good in terms of empowering the women and making sure that they were able to improve their livelihoods with the businesses that they started with this support. So members of these groups had to agree to only invest in conservation compatible businesses with the funding, the monies that they made. And then the project only provided mentoring and financial management training for these groups. So these groups were not given any seed money for them to start up these groups, just the knowledge, the capacity building of how to do it, how to document, and how to allocate the funds, the lending, and all that. So no seed money was provided. So everything they've been doing, the monies that they've been raising, is money from the communities themselves. So in terms of what we were tracking, what were we tracking in terms of outcomes? What were we measuring? So because this is about improving the livelihoods, we're tracking the income streams. So from baseline, somebody who just joined, looking at the increase in the income streams. So if you look at the analysis that was done, the report, we find that some members had up to 4 income streams in terms of increase. And then the increase, of course, in terms of the income that they received at the end of the payouts. So once they do the savings at the end of the year, they were able to do the payouts. And from that, we were able to track the increases in terms of the income. And then conservation perceptions, I know this is something that is this is also something that we had indicators around, because one of the things that the project was doing was also to educate the members about conservation and its value. So because of the membership and the number of people that were involved in these groups, we found that there were a number of people within the communities who were able to even act as law enforcement officers, because people knew that they were part of these groups and they were looked upon as an extension of the law enforcement arm. So in terms of probably how we can now align what we did with the theories of change, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Giselle to run us through what lessons were learned through this conservation enterprise that was promoted, and how we are moving forward with the lessons that were learned. Giselle, over to you.
Thanks, Angela, for that. Basically, I think in terms of alignment of our activity to the theory of change, when you look at the first condition, which is enabling conditions, you could see that I think for us, in terms of community conservation banks, enabling conditions were there, and they were able to succeed. And unfortunately for community conservancies and horticultural groups, that was not in place. I think for conservancies is the aspect of the legal framework. I think we'll discuss that in terms when it gets to lessons learned. Whereas for horticultural groups, this is related to market linkages, as well as issues of the crop consultation with the communities, the crop that was good for them. I think in here you have to realize, I think the area was working in an area that was both a very area and as well as the escarpment, areas that have human-wildlife conflict, areas that have no human-wildlife conflict. So the crop that was introduced to them was not good for them in terms of they didn't appreciate chili for them to succeed. Next slide, please. Well, in terms of were they able to realize the benefits? So if you look at it, the way community conservation banks are set up, obviously there was an increased income, and from that income, from their savings, they're able to open up different small-scale businesses, as well as the biggest thing, I think the biggest aspect that they got to benefit from was the aspect of a social fund. This social fund they could use for paying for education fees, access health fees. So you found that even when they don't have money for saving, women and members could actually get into, they had to save for social funds. So they found that really useful. And that's one of the things that has made it quite successful. And the other aspect is really as for women empowerment. And so one of the things that you see is the group serve as agents of community, agents of change. My colleague mentioned that 70% of the members in there were women. So you have opportunities of actually mentoring women leadership in community conservation resources, boards, association. So that was really a very good opportunity. Next, please. When you look at aspects of stakeholder attitudes and behaviors, what you find is that because one of the prerequisites for being a member of the community conservation banks or participating in these activities was positive behavior change. Now, like my colleague mentioned, you find that for them to be able to participate, you had other community members thinking that, oh, they would, whenever they did something wrong, they'll be reported on. But I think the other aspect that you get is that because of the benefits that they realized, and that was related to conservation, they started really changing their behaviors, as my colleague mentioned. I think some of the things that we had measured about their perception towards the wildlife in that area. Did we see any threats reduced in terms of biodiversity? Well, unfortunately, it's quite difficult to measure this. But one of the things that we get as anecdotally is that this is an area that is this is Zambia's best protected area in terms of law enforcement, because this is the area where we have our rhinos. But in terms of elephant poaching, you had those issues coming on board now where you get to have, I think there was anecdotally, there was a reduction in at least 50% of elephant poaching that was reduced. This was, unfortunately, this was not systematically measured. And this is one thing that we get to find, I think, as we move on further into the lessons that we've learned. How do we move forward? Next slide, please. How do we move forward, I think? What lessons did we learn? As we move forward, the next activities I think that we're really looking at is we're looking at market linkages and partnership. I think these are key for private sector engagement. So you're looking at aspects of even the community conservation, in as much as they were successful, they needed linkages to probably mobile money, partnership, private sector capital coming in so that there could be more money that could be available for them to set up their businesses. Community buying and steady flow of benefits is a very key aspect for that, I think. So you get a situation where you have, I think you get a situation where you have, because of the benefits that they saw from the social fund, the community members were able to establish this and run them by themselves. The other aspect, I think this I mentioned, is community enterprises, I think, provide a very big opportunity for promoting women leadership in conservation. So I think that's a key aspect. And for our activities that we're looking at in terms of design, we've looked at integrated activities. So we're looking at currently the health, ecosystem, and agriculture for resilient, thriving societies. USAID Zambia is putting in about 20 million US dollars of biodiversity, FTF, WASH, and mother and child health funds into this activity. So one of the things that you realize it's an integrated approach, I think, is a very important aspect, I think, to be able to achieve what we're really looking at. I don't know, Shona, do you have any questions for us from what Angela and I have just discussed?
Well, thanks so much, Jessiel and Angela. That was really helpful. And I think what I really appreciated is a lot of the similarities in terms of some of the outcomes and outputs from these activities with Uganda, just in terms of, you know, the improvement of the relationship between communities and the authorities in these areas, the importance of kind of perceptions around conservation, the need for community governance structures as a core enabling condition. And I think what was really interesting is the discussion around women's engagement and women's empowerment. And I'm just wondering how this type of learning and the successes under these activities are being wrapped into the new design under Hearth. And do you see, I think also you raised a similar point to the issue in Uganda in terms of, are we measuring that ultimate kind of biodiversity conservation impact, and how you see that happening going forward?
Well, okay. So what we have with the situation. Then we need. So with the integrated land resource governance program that Angela had mentioned, we followed up with these activities to go and do a deep dive gender assessment, gender and wildlife assessment. So that report, I think, is just being finalized. We have a draft, and we're just now getting to use that, the findings from that report, to get into our new hearth design. And I think that is key for us. That's why we are really looking at mother and child health and getting to use women participation, trying to build up those aspects. In addition, what we fund under the Integrated Land Resource Governance is support to the Zambia National CRB Association. So we're trying to see how those results can be implemented, can be inculcated in the election guidelines. I think that we're already doing for community resources boards, so that we can ensure that women are actively involved in community resources boards. So those, because our focus is in community areas, so those are the areas that we'll be working in with the hearth activities that are coming on board shortly.
And maybe also just to add that I think for us, we see an opportunity now with the experience that we've had, the challenges that we saw with the North Wangwa, now going into new activity design with new activities. Like just now, my colleague talked about the hearth, where now we'll be integrating, of course, with other sectors. We are going to carry on, I think, the lessons that we learned in terms of asking those questions within the theory of change. I think we didn't critically look at that at the time that we're doing the design for that activity. But now we have the leverage for us to be able to go through the theories of change and ask those critical questions in terms of the enabling environments, the conditions that are in place, and to see how we can even replicate and expand on some of the things that we saw worked out under the North Wangwa. So I think for us going forward, I think it's very exciting because we do have an opportunity to try and implement some of the things that we saw working out, and of course make improvements where we saw that things didn't work out. Over.
Unmuted.
That's great. Thank you very much. That's really helpful. And I guess I know we're kind of short on time. So my other question is, because you did also highlight kind of the need for private sector engagement, is how do you see that private sector engagement across the portfolio then going forward? What were areas that were gaps in the previous activity, and are you shifting approaches to kind of also incorporate some of the new agency guidance around private sector engagement?
So I'm glad you brought up that question. Private sector engagement is a key aspect of our portfolio, not just the Environment Office, but the larger Economic Development Office. So what is happening right now, for all the activities that are coming on board, there is some level of private sector engagement. Now, what kind of private sector engagement? So if you look at initially the hearth, we had thought of just doing an integrated activity. But when the opportunity to get into a GDA came on board, we thought this is the right one, because it has those market linkages which are key for a global development alliance. So those are really key for us, I think, moving in terms of both private sector. But not really, I think, in as much as it is important, we're also addressing issues of policy with other mechanisms. But I think market linkages are key for us when it comes to livelihood support for very remote areas that we work in. I think for some of our enterprises to really succeed, there has to be aspects of market linkages.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to add a little bit about our vision and what we're doing in terms of engaging with the private sector. I think even as an office, I think, Shona, you'll see when you join us that currently we have some activities that are in design that are trying to look at how we can enhance and catalyze private sector involvement in our sector. So these are issues that we're really taking very, very strongly. And we feel that going forward, this is the way to go for USAID and for all our activities. We have to involve the private sector, because that's when you can be assured in terms of sustainability of whatever interventions that you put in place if the private sector are able to take it on. So how can we come in to look at their barriers into them coming to get themselves involved in all these activities? So currently we do have a number of activities that are in the pipeline that are going to help in terms of removing some of the barriers that are there currently that are making the private sector not to invest into this sector.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to working with you both and with the team in Zambia.
Thanks, Shona. Looking forward to your coming.
Yes, thank you, Shona.
Great, thanks guys. That was really great to hear about kind of where you're at in your portfolio and kind of the things that Shona needs to keep in mind as she is looking before she prepares to come to Zambia. Can we have the next slide, please? So we had 2 questions come in, and I do want to make sure that we dedicate time to talk about those. We had one question from Carlos Hasbun in the Latin America Bureau about in Uganda, Shona, kind of how are you measuring? What kind of indicators might you have for both, you know, and this ties into the second question, which came from Luis in El Salvador around how do we make sure that we're creating meaningful livelihoods and income for people as well as conserving biodiversity. We also collected the tips that we, I think maybe let's give a couple minutes to addressing those 2 questions, and then we'll move on to the next slide just to show you what some of the tips that we got so far from Pull Everywhere were. And then just some other questions that I wanted to throw out there, especially in your transitions. How do you document and keep your files? I mean, that's, you know, obviously just your written knowledge, but that has to be challenging. And then also I wanted to come back to other tips or recommendations that we might get from our participants in terms of transferring knowledge from one to the others. So Anna, Maggie, do you want to try the first question?
Sure. This is Shana. Oh, I think those are fantastic questions, and I think that kind of the ultimately that's the direction that we're trying to go, is to sort of create that direct link between the conservation enterprises and the conservation outcomes. And I think something we've learned in terms of measuring, you know, it's been fairly easy to measure things like the economic benefits and things like changes in income, but it's been much more difficult to sort of measure changes in incentives and what's, you know, is it just about the money, or what are those other elements that we need to be looking at? And so I think, interestingly enough, some of the things that we found through these like focus group discussions and using different types of M&E as part of the learning plan is really looking at, well, what are the incentives around that? And so, you know, we're measuring the economic impact and the economic incentives, but what are the other reasons that these communities are going to engage in conservation as well? And so things like the improved relationship between the Uganda Wildlife Authority and these communities has been critical, because human-wildlife conflict is a major issue. And so by providing those economic opportunities and that engagement with the wildlife authorities, that relationship has improved, and rather than being contentious, it's really developed into a much stronger partnership. So those are some of the areas that we're looking at in terms of how do you measure success and what's driving that success. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Shana. Nathan, you want to try to move into the next slide? We're going to share with you some of the, I know there's a lot of feedback coming in from my side. This is what we heard from you in terms of what has worked when you've moved to new posts. So we got a reading list just to hear more about the country, introductions to relevant stakeholders, a summary of the portfolio and regular meetings to go over it, meetings face-to-face, that's always beneficial, a clear and concise briefing on the current portfolio, understanding the political economy, what was working well and not working well and why. I got some good answers and questions from my colleagues. So if you have any other tips you'd like to share, please put them in the chat box and we will come back to those. Thanks for pulling those up on the fly, Nathan and Lexine. That was great. Let's go back to maybe one of our other questions around kind of what's, I know, Shauna, you talked a little bit about that, some of the monitoring work that you're doing. I think we might have to have muted you, but maybe Maggie or Shauna or Jessiel or Angela, you could address this question on how are you really measuring from stakeholders that improved income question. Maybe let's try Angela or Jessiel first. Do either one of you have anything to say on that?
Okay, so maybe I can start with the same example that we gave for the conservation groups that we had, the micro lending groups that we had. So basically for that, we did have, I think, some indicators how we're tracking progress on that. And I think I talked about some of the ways in which we're using in terms of tracking outcomes. So the income streams, number of income streams was one of them where we're tracking the number of income streams compared to the baseline. So we'd compare the control, like for those that were not part of the groups and those that were within the groups, the baseline from where they started from, and then how they've been able to progress from when they started and then throughout the process. And then also the income itself, like the amount of monies that they were getting, because at the end of the year, they were giving themselves dividends. So this is money that they would have saved themselves, but also from the interest, from the lending, from the loans that they would have lent out, and then they would get those dividends. So the money is the income at the end of the day, were some of the things that we were tracking for the saving groups. In terms of the perceptions, the conservation perceptions, I think these were more descriptive in terms of how people now perceived the wildlife around them, and if they were they were willing to continue to preserve these resources that they have around them, and what they felt. So really those were some of the parameters that we used for the saving groups in terms of measuring impact and measuring success. Jessiel?
Well, I guess the other aspect that comes in when you look at examples of community conservation banks is what I mentioned about the health fund, social fund that supports health and education. So when you're really looking at creating meaningful livelihoods, it's those kind of things that they see a value in it and they're able to sustain it themselves. Then the other thing is, there are times when we talk about honey production, all these other things, conservation agriculture, but the biggest thing is, are we linking them to the market? Is it increasing income? So those kind of private sector linkages, integrated programming that doesn't really look at only biodiversity, but looks at people's livelihood. I think that's a big thing that needs to come in when you're really looking at alternative livelihood and conservation enterprises. Thank you.
Muted.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that in terms of how we're looking at the Uganda portfolio. I mean, we're definitely tracking the income itself, but also for these activities, we're looking at contributions to village savings and loans groups, and then also repayment of those loans. So we're tracking kind of the back end is that are they gaining enough income then to be able to meet their obligations, and linked to that again are also the social aspects of the fund. So how are those then resources being used to benefit the individual households or communities in terms of feeding back into support for healthcare. And in terms of the private sector linkages, one thing that we saw that was very interesting is that there's, in one area that we're working, there's both sugar production and seed oil production. And so with some of these private sector partnerships, the private sector actors were benefiting from improved relationships between the wildlife authorities and better engagement from the communities. And so there was a willingness to contribute to some of these loan mechanisms by the private sector, but then also contribute in-kind support. So things like, you know, if there was an animal attack or someone was injured, both Sunco and Kenyara Sugar agreed to treat community members for free at their facilities. And so in terms of some of those other benefits, it's not, we're not necessarily tracking indicators, but that's where it's really important to be looking at both the qualitative and quantitative aspects of the larger learning plan.
Great, thank you, Shauna. And Luis is asking a question about impact evaluations and conservation enterprises, which I think we will have to come back to in a whole nother webinar. And I know we have a certain participant here on our webinars today from Nepal. Welcome, Netra. And maybe we could hear from you about the impact evaluation in Nepal. We did here, I think presenting back the results would be another great webinar for us. We have one more slide, I think, if we want to move on to our final kind of wrap up here. I do think if you want to go back, we have a kind of a wrap up poll question again for you. If you want to put that in the chat box, both to I think we'll have two links show up here in the chat box. If you could help us out by just sharing what other webinar topics like Luis just did, which we want to give you the content that's most meaningful for you. And then I think the next is our final M&E question. We have our last question, if you want to go to that next slide. We would really like to hear from you about how likely you are to apply this knowledge in your work. So if you could fill out those polls for us, that would really help us measure our own progress and make sure that we're delivering the content for you that is most meaningful for your work. I do want to put a plug in as we wrap up for our next webinar. We'll feature the community forestry work that USAID Peru is doing, and Monica, I think, was also on the webinar today. Look forward to learning more from you about that program. And then our last slide, please. As you keep filling out the polls, thank you very much for that. I just want to direct everyone back to our website where we do have a Conservation Enterprise Learning Group site and our learning agenda, which this webinar will be posted at this site. And you can also find recordings from our past webinars and lots of resources there for you, including a new M&E monitoring evaluation framework that we worked on over the summer at the Environment Officers Conference, but also helped with tips on what to measure along our theory of change. So once again, I just wanted to share my thanks to our presenters today, Maggie, Shauna, Angela, and Jessiel. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and hang in there, everybody, and have a great day.